Because session is being recorded. Great. Okay, welcome to the Transforming Assessment webinar series. This is the August edition. Today's session is about discouraging academic dishonesty and having a shift towards authentic assessment. So today's speakers are Carol Miles and Keith Foggett, who unfortunately Keith is a bit under the weather. So Carol will be our main speaker for today. So thanks, Carol. Would you begin, please?
Hey, welcome everyone. This is a topic that Keith and I have been doing a fair amount of presenting and work around, and it's really looking at the importance of authentic assessment. Let's just move this here. And how if we look at really transforming our assessments to authentic modes, a lot of our issues with academic dishonesty, which so many people are worrying about these days, will tend to go away. In our practice here at the University of Newcastle, in sort of the academic development field, we are finding a lot of university teachers being very concerned these days about the potential for their students to cheat in a number of ways. Everyone's talking about contract cheating. It's in the news. It's one of the big topics, I guess, for a lot of research these days. When you just get academics together, you'll hear these rumors of widespread and rampant contract cheating. None of the students are doing it. We have a lot of discussions here at the university around how we need to maintain certain types of traditional assessments in order to assure the veracity of who the students are. And that's often why people are still defending face-to-face high-stakes exams as one of the only solution, because the student has to rock up with their student card and prove that they are who they say they are. This is particularly problematic, however, when we start moving to different kinds of online environments, because that's just often not possible at all. Despite the fears, the reality that a number of researchers in Australia and other ones around the world have been finding is that the meta-analyses looking at how many students are actually engaging in contract cheating looks to be somewhere, by most reports, between around 2 and 8% of students that would engage in contract cheating by purchasing essays, for example, to submit as their own work, to do any of those types of activities. What concerns us to me as somebody who's really interested in university assessment is that those somewhere between 2 and 8% of students are causing people to fundamentally change how they are assessing students' achievement of learning outcomes, just to try to avoid the potential for those students to cheat. However, I think what we need to remember is that what we're saying is that 90% or more, and by most reports it is more, of our students are not attempting to cheat. So directing our focus toward that the few percent of students may not be the right way to look at it. The students we should be designing our assessments for really are the ones that are not cheating in the first place, and or for all of the students. What our argument is that if these assessments are authentically aligned with the students' career aspirations, the expectations of the employers, really a bonus outcome will be that it's very, very difficult for students who choose to cheat to do so easily, because the assessments will be very customized. Authentic assessment is something that focuses on students using and applying their knowledge, applying the skills that they have from their university courses into real life settings, and that often is something that is very motivating for students. Examples, and I don't need to tell many of you a lot of examples of the types of authentic assessments we may see students doing: completing any type of real world task, assessments that are held in workplace settings, but certainly also simulations, role plays, case studies. At the end of this presentation, we'll go through a number of other potentials that people can use for authentic assessment. The key is these assessment tools are not traditional university assessments. They are not what most of us are used to and what students, for years and years have been used to in university, because those are the things that are being replicated by contract cheating companies. Now, one of the struggles that we've had going around, I guess basically around the world, talking about this, is that whether we like it or not, and it's not certainly just the Australian context, I'm from Canada originally, and it's 100% that situation there as well, is that whether universities like it or not, we have become a market-driven enterprise. We are no longer that institution that is meant primarily to generally educate the population so that they can have more entertaining conversations on Saturday mornings during the hunt. We are a job preparation institution as a university, and I think we should be proud of that. We certainly have been for a number of years, and we do have interesting conversations with people from different disciplines around this, but truthfully, medicine and law, very, very vocationally focused and always have been, and I don't think it's an embarrassment that we should start thinking about our students preparing themselves for a career and for their jobs that are coming. Authentic tasks validate the student's choice of program and eventual career. It makes them excited first when they start a university program that they are actually finding themselves doing things that will show that they will become what they want to be, whether that is a doctor, whether that is an engineer, whether that's a nurse or a teacher or a manager. They get a feeling right away of being excited by these things. The other thing it can do is it can definitely produce student buy-in for their program, so that very sort of shaky, iffy point in a first semester for university students where they're wondering if they've done the right thing. Authentic assessment tasks and feeling like they're doing what they're going to do as a career can really help with those things as well. And honestly, authenticity is a fundamental characteristic of good assessment practice. Students value it. And honestly, for us that are teaching and us that are marking, it's a lot more fun than a lot of our more traditional assessment tasks. The two most, I guess, prevalent assessment tasks that we look at in these contexts are essays and examinations, and most of them have very little application in a real world setting. And when we're talking about essays, what we're really talking about is that traditional in-text referenced academic essay, specified number of words, required number of references. And the argument is that while we're having students do these, and frankly, if you add up the number of this type of essay that most university students have done over the years, there are quite a number of them. And we use them often as a primary means of measuring student achievement of a variety of learning outcomes, when often we would argue mostly we are measuring student achievement of mastering the ability to write an academic essay. Here's the thing. If you think about university assessment psychometrically, the classical test or assessment model would tell us that any score and every score that we have of any kind of human achievement or even beyond that is comprised of two parts. There is the true score, and that's the reflective part of whatever is being measured, and there's error. And I think if we think about this in real context in university, there are a number of different things that are always a part of a student's grade or a student's score that is error in one form or another. Common sources of error in universities, and we could stop and have a chat this right now, and I know lots of you would be able to contribute to this for the sake of time, I guess, as much as anything. Maybe we'll just go over some of them. One of the big sources of error, obviously, is plagiarism. We'll get back to that in a moment. Subjective grading. In other words, the same piece of work is marked by 3 different markers and given 3 different scores. Part of that result is the actual performance by the student. The rest is error. Lack of clarity and expectations for assignments, inconsistencies or applications of the rubrics. I'm sure lots of you could, other sources of error in university assessment scores, any quality of the student. If a student is stressed, if a student is ill, for example, then that score is not reflective of their abilities in the area and measuring the learning outcome that we're discussing. Part of our concerns here then, and this really is relating back to traditional types of university assessment, is a concern around validity. Does the assessment measure what it is supposed to measure? And in many traditional academic assessments, such as essays and honestly such as exams as well, often we are measuring a very limited scope of student abilities. Reliability, on the other hand, is seeing how consistently and how fair and replicable the assessment is, so that if the same student performed the same way in a repeated number of times, would they get roughly the same score? And the big one, and often now when we're looking at online assessment, I think this is becoming front and center in many ways, and that is practicality of university assessment. How much effort is it for the student to write it, for the student to complete it in order to measure whatever learning outcome we're looking at, and how much work is it to assess and is it to mark? And one of the things we talk to lots of academics about is that there's no embarrassment in having a conversation around the amount of time and effort it takes to mark a particular piece of work. And if it's disproportionate to the learning outcome that's being measured or the amount of work that the students put into it, that is a valid concern and one that needs to be discussed. So let's go back to the I guess in our world, much maligned essay at this point. We've wondered, why is the academic essay so popular as a university assessment tool? Almost every course you look at will have some form of academic essay in it. Part of the reason is that people do, I guess, in universities what we've always done, and we tend to do unto others what others have done to us. If we're used to seeing the essay as an assessment tool, then that's something that we will create for our students. But I think it goes beyond that in a number of ways. It is perhaps the most commonly and frequently used assessment tool outside of tests and exams. In universities, very few students that you talk to won't have been required to write a number of essays. I guess one of the things when we go back to validity and reliability is the question that is, can the academic essay be seen to be a valid measurement tool? What are we measuring with the essay and how, and what challenges to validity exist with the academic essay? I'm just seeing Matthew mentioning here, which is very, very true, workload issues. The more sophisticated and authentic the assessment task, the harder it is to mark. I think we might be able to show that that's not always the case. Multiple choices auto-marked by computer are one thing. However, there are authentic types of assessments that would be considerably less work to mark than an essay, and I think what Paul says there is very true, is it really depends on the assessment task. But Jay just mentioned something I think we really need to discuss, and that is saying he remembered being counseled to keep essays in his course because it's the essays that makes a course academic. And this gets to the real core of something that we often discuss, which is this attempt to academicize everything that we do. And the one way that people seem to be able to go about doing this is by introducing an in-text reference to academic essay that's referencing published research to that extent. Some of the programs that we've worked with that have had some real challenges and whose students have had some real challenges writing essays and getting through their first year of university have been programs that traditionally weren't included in university. Nursing and education are two that come to mind. Nurses, as most of you are aware, used to be taught to be nurses in hospitals by a complex system basically of apprenticeships, and teachers were trained in teachers' colleges. When these things evolved to become university degrees, a lot of pressure was put on a certain number of people, anyone teaching in those disciplines, to make this more academic, because now there were university degrees. And one of the ways people do that immediately is to introduce an academic essay. Sarah's just mentioned essays are perceived to be an induction into the academy, and that's absolutely true. And it's one of the reasons that people do it, and a disciplinary practice in humanities and arts. But I would say, Jane, that traditional academic essay is not the only thing in humanities and arts that would allow people to participate in their discipline in authentic ways. And I think it's something that we need to remember. Writing the essay in and of itself, if it's just to make a program more academic, needs to lead us back a bit, at least, to looking at what our learning outcomes are in the first place. When we asked students about this task, it's very interesting. I had a conversation with my one of my colleagues a couple of years ago after we had had a meeting, probably some student experience committee type meeting, around how we wanted to introduce our undergraduate students to more research. We wanted them to become familiar with the research that their teachers were conducting, and getting them as undergrads more involved and engaged in knowing about the research in the university. Great idea, everybody agrees. Shortly after that, a student survey results, the S-Fund survey, some of you are, I think, familiar with it, were distributed, and one of the very strong comments that came out was that students said there was too much research involved in their degree, and they didn't want to be involved in that much research again. And this was very confusing, and my colleague who was responsible for this said, well, I didn't think we really exposed them to much research at all. Why are they saying too much research? But those of you who are attending, what did the students mean by research? And I think this is something that's really important that we need to understand when we're putting essays front and center. Students meant looking up journal articles to reference in their academic essays. People use the term research all the time now relating to the internet. If you say to a friend or a colleague, what did you do last night? They might say, I'm buying a new car, so I was doing research on Google. That's not research, that's search. And students very much see this as one of the primary tasks that they have that they don't always see as being particularly relevant. I noticed Trish says that she teaches nursing and there are many ways to assess and evaluate learning, and there are, and that's a great thing. And I think that part of the authentic part of this is when you're teaching and when you're assessing your nurses, that they feel that they're doing a task that's nursing related. Another concern, I think, about what we're measuring is, are we measuring learning outcomes or are we measuring essay writing skills? My colleague with the laryngitis right now, who's here but is not talking, is in charge of our learning development area at the University of Newcastle. One of the things that his team, and he will tell you, is that once you teach a student how to master the technique of writing an academic essay, they'll come for assistance for a bit, and then eventually they will go away because they've learned how to master getting through university. And that's not always that they're demonstrating the achievement of the active and measurable learning outcomes that they're given, but they know how to write an essay. Part of the issue there is that a lot of academic essays are graded with a focus on mechanics and referencing rather than on the learning outcomes of the course. We often hear people say that it's easier to mark the technicalities, it's easier to mark the reference list than to actually look at whether or not the students are achieving the goals of the course. Another concern here, obviously, is that this also implies a requirement for fairly highly skilled language ability. And the language ability of the student is going to be one of the things that will attack the validity of the student indicating their achievement of a learning outcome through a complex writing task such as an essay. All kinds of sessions, we do them here at the Center for Teaching and Learning. There are lots and lots of different support mechanisms out there for students, lots of things online to teach them how to write an essay, how to write an academic essay. The real point, however, that I think is probably important is that there's got to be something beyond it other than the skill to write an essay. One thing we'll say to our university teachers, if we're talking about this in a room full of academics, is that if we gave you an essay task on a topic that you had no knowledge of whatsoever, first year style essay task, and we gave you an hour with a laptop and the Wikipedia, would you be able to write an essay that would probably pass? And most people will say, yes, I could, because they know how to write the essay themselves. And that's one of those things that we just get used to. As we teach our students how to write that essay, one of the risks is that we're not really engaging them in the authenticity of the learning outcomes that they're trying to measure. What do people intend to measure with academic essays is a question that we ask, or is measurement the main purpose? And many will say, no, we're not. This is not only about measurement. This is about using the essay as a formative learning activity in and of itself. I'm not sure if you agree with this, but I certainly know lots of people will say that the student will learn through writing the essay that they will gain knowledge and they will achieve learning outcomes as they're doing, I guess, their search versus research, and where they're learning. What is the formative part, however? And this is where we often have this conversation. Is the formative part searching the literature and reading, or is it writing the essay in an academic style, or what else would it be? Because in some ways, and I think here's where we have to look to some of our students whose primary language or whose first language of learning was not necessarily English, is that if searching the literature and reading helps them to achieve the learning outcome that was set out for them in the course, whatever that was, and it may be something very concrete. At that point, have they achieved the learning outcome? And if they then have to turn and prove, that they've achieved that learning outcome by writing an essay in an academic style, is that indeed an entirely different outcome that they're looking for? Is there a way, and here's our question about some ideas for authentic assessments. Is there a way to take that point where they have achieved that learning and give them other methods of showing their achievement of the learning outcome that are not only more authentic to the future workplace, but also more fun for them to do, and potentially for those who struggle with English, an easier yet still valid way to indicate their ability? Blog posts, where I'm just looking briefly at the chat here, and certainly a blog post is something that a lot of people are turning to now as a more authentic method of assessment. And yes, where do essays fit into the workplace? Because we have made the very bold statement that most students will graduate and will never write another academic essay style again. What people argue for the essay: students need to learn the art of persuasion and argument, and I agree, yes, they do. However, one of the I guess, areas of struggle that we've really had with some of our own academics is how many students are asked as their very first university assignment in their first semester of their first year to write this academic essay, and often not given any real training in how to do it. Also, many of our colleagues will say that students need to engage in evidence-based practice, whether these are nursing students, whether they're engineering students, that they need to engage with the literature. And again, I don't think that anyone would argue with this, but often our question is, at what level of Bloom's taxonomy are your students currently performing? And most students need to achieve those lower levels of the taxonomy. They need to be able to learn the content prior to engaging in persuasion or argument. And of course, yes, they need to cite appropriately. Once again, in our experience, often they aren't taught this explicitly. There's a lot of expectation there. A lot of expectation that a student will just go out and learn how to do all of these academic things automatically. One of the biggest risks with this is that the emphasis is on mechanics, and especially if you've got large numbers of students and large groups of markers all marking the same thing, people will spend an inordinate amount of time going through the reference list, looking at the formatting, making sure it's an AND, not an ampersand when you're quoting. And to be honest, these days, all of that can be done automatically anyway. If you watch a student writing an essay, if you look at the work that's being done by the student, you will see very much that they will spend as much time on their reference list and on making sure their references are written correctly as they do on the actual argument in the essay. And that's just a shame. You probably can't see this very well. I was hoping that the screen would show it bigger. Really, I just popped this rubric in. It's an old rubric. We don't use it anymore, but I wanted to give you an example. This was a first year essay assignment. It was being marked out of 20. And if you look at this marking rubric, virtually everything on it is marking formatting of writing the essay and the essay itself, rather than actually marking achievement of a particular learning outcome. Please note, an academic essay was not a learning outcome of the course, and it rarely is a learning outcome of the course. Here's another example, something very similar. You'll notice part 1 on this one says critical analysis of the reading. This is one of the most frustrating things as an academic developer that I've seen, is the term critical analysis seems to have become a flavor of the day in the last 5 years. We see an awful lot of learning outcomes that say critically analyze. I would argue that until a student is familiar with the concepts and the content and the definitions of any academic area, they are unable to critically analyze things. So asking first year, first semester students to critically analyze work and to demonstrate this critical analysis through an academic essay is premature, to say the least. Sadly, in many cases, though, depending on how things are written, students can pass or fail on italics or on a hanging indent. We all used to joke how every APA version would hang their indent, and then the next version they would unhang their indent, and that was to sell books. Now it's all online, but the indents continue to go in and out and shouldn't be something our students are worried about as compared to achieving the outcomes of their course. So why would we ask them to critically analyze or synthesize something before they have shown us an understanding of application, especially first-year students or even second-year students? And ideally, we wouldn't. Truthfully and ideally, we wouldn't ask students to do this, but so many university teachers feel a tremendous compulsion to meet every graduate attribute and graduate learning outcome of an entire program in their own course, that we put too much pressure on ourselves, I think, to start measuring things beyond what our students could authentically achieve. When you're evaluating essay assignments, just to ask you to take a quick look at, what is the actual learning outcome being assessed? And I will repeat this. Take a look at the course outline. Is writing an academic essay, is academic referencing, is format and style part of the learning outcome? If it's not, we really, based on constructive alignment, should not be putting marks on it. Are the requirements clear? Is the word limit appropriate for the task? This is a huge one. Often we'll ask an academic, they won't always do it, can you write a perfect answer within that word limit? How easy would the task be to plagiarize? And this is what gets us back to why we're really here and what we're discussing today. Because a standard academic essay is a really easy thing to plagiarize in many, many cases. What student characteristics obviously might affect their performance? Is English their first language? Are they a skilled writer, etc.? Things to consider. I'm going to show you this one very quickly. We're quickly running through time. This is an old assignment no longer being used that caused us a lot of stress. It was basically asking students, I've kind of masked what it actually was, but in this case it was a business assignment, asking students to write a very high stakes 50% essay assigned in the first 3 weeks of class, first semester, first year, to engage with a piece of academic writing, and then to provide an overview of, as you can see here, mechanisms of social inclusion, exclusion, must include. 2,500 words is a big essay for the first one a student's ever been asked to write. They are asked to reference appropriate theory. They had to look at academic literature. Our learning development team had students running screaming to them from all angles about this task. And here's the real kicker. The content did not include this theory at all. This assessment was given to these students so that they would learn the theory on their own because it was one of the requirements of the course. First 3 weeks, Jay? Yep, that's right. Can you imagine this? And what happened was our very skilled learning advisors actually wrote massive amounts of assistance for these students to try to help them get through the assignment. It's gone, thank heavens. All right, the academic integrity part of this. Intentional plagiarism is when a student either gets someone else to write their work, as you know, or when a student goes out and purchases a paper through contract cheating or from some other way. Unintentional plagiarism is something that an awful lot of our new university teachers worry a lot about, and that is really where students just don't know how to reference properly. And I think we need to think about whether or not that's academic dishonesty, and are we teaching them how to do it. I know that our student academic conduct officers certainly have a lot of students sent to them, and their conclusion is they weren't intentionally plagiarizing anything, they just don't know how to reference. And again, some of this comes down to us teaching our students before we measure them on things. But can you buy essays online? All of the people that are currently on here, we've got 41 people. I'm just curious how many of you, I'm going to try to do this, and it may or may not work, but I'm not sure I can actually create it. I won't bother right now. I was going to try to create a little poll, but maybe you can just say on the things, how many of you have ever been approached to buy an academic essay just from some site or other? I know I get emails all the time. Our university has now blocked somewhere between 600 and 700 sites that sell contract cheating essays to students. So yeah, see, lots of you are saying no, and I know people that are just approached all the time trying to sell them, so I'm not sure how. Here's the thing, we've blocked from our university 600 or 700 sites. That doesn't really do much when the student goes home. However, what they're selling generally is they are selling generic academic in-text referenced essays on any given subject. They'll have price lists. You can say if you want distinction, you'll pay $400. If you want a high distinction, you'll pay $600. But what they are is they're originally generated essays, often generated by bots. If you have authentic assessments, if you have assessments that are specific to your local area, these are very, very difficult for people to purchase on the internet. I'm going to zoom very quickly in the expense of time through part of this presentation, which talks about exams and how unauthentic exams are as well. It's not a real world situation. Few real world tasks lock you in a room and won't let you reference, etc. And I think some people would argue with that. We have a whole other area that I know has been discussed in this forum and is being discussed in the future on a handwritten exam, and is that authentic these days? So suffice to say that exams are not authentic assessments either, and in what jobs are students not allowed to refer to resources when they're completing tasks or making important decisions? There are some entrance exams in the real world to get into professions, but very few professions beyond that would require no reference materials to be used. And one of the things we ask is, could time memorizing material for exams be spent by students preparing more authentic tasks that would be replicable in a workplace? And that is something, again, I do understand that there are a number of different areas and different professions that do require a big high stakes certification exam prior to practice. And for those reasons, should students be prepared? Of course, but that is a different reason for a high stakes closed book exam than, I would argue, just to identify the veracity of who the student is and their identification. So if we're thinking authentic assessment, if we're thinking about some of the ways that students feel that university is really preparing them for the workplace and what will get them pumped about their career and what they want to do, we have a whole lot of lists here. I'm just really going to go through a few of these because you'll get the idea. The real point of most of these assessments, if written correctly, is that it's almost impossible to purchase it from one of those contract cheating clearinghouses off of the internet. If you make it local, if, for example, we're looking at public health and we asked here in Newcastle, we asked some our students to identify a quality of the John Hunter Hospital and talk about that. That is something that would be very, very difficult to get a generic clearinghouse, many of which, by the way, exist in Asia, to do. The more you can link your students' work to their own local community, and for your online students, they may be in a lot of different local communities. We understand that. But if you tell them to go to a school in their area, report on something that is authentic, it is much, much more difficult to purchase. And the whole conversation around exams and authentic e-tools is one that we are struggling with forever for online as well. And what is an exam? And I think that's another part of it. Here's a few examples, some that I think have been very, very successful. I've used some. I've certainly had colleagues that have. I'm going to jump to one here that's event-initiated examples, and that one is interesting because we had people quite excited. The Newcastle we've had Formula One racing in Newcastle for the last couple of years. Some of the people in town are happy, some are not. But the truth is, a number of our different academic disciplines around communications, etc., have sent students to do marketing for those events, to look at what the events are, how they might market the event, and to be actually engaged in the events when they're doing it, which is often very, very interesting. Letters to the editor also have been very, very successful. A different example on letter to the editor of something that I found very helpful at times, and I've had colleagues who've done this actually for years, is having students submit a very brief piece to the Wikipedia. Go into the Wikipedia deeply enough to find, you know how often it'll say more information here, need a reference here, need more things there. Have the student write 2 paragraphs, beautifully written, and actually submit them to the Wikipedia. When they get accepted, they love it. They absolutely love it. Literature reviews can be bought via contract cheating. Yes, there's a comment here by Paul. It really depends on what and how you're asking to be reviewed. And if they're writing just a literature review by itself, rather than an academic essay per se, they can be very different. It can be more difficult to read. As authentic, I would say that's a more senior task. Love this one. Design a theme for a conference. Ask the students to describe why in their field of study this conference theme would be good. What's been going on in the world these days? Yeah, the wiki idea is great. And the last person I know that did that, about half their students had their couple of paragraphs accepted by the Wikipedia. They were over the moon. They just loved it. Writing a diary entry for a famous person. Creating a web page. One of my absolute favorites. Let's go to the next page here. I love the idea of nominating somebody for a Nobel Prize. Anybody that you want. Adopting any kind of a persona. Another one that students really enjoy that you could think about, and think about how hard most of these would be to buy from a contract cheating perspective. Writing a resume or cover letter, real or fictional. One of the best ways to do that with your students is tell them to imagine that they're 10 years older than they are right now and write their resume. And write that resume to what they have done since they graduated, and then show what kind of a job they're going to advertise, what they're going to apply for, and write a cover letter. Presentations, submissions for public inquiry, fantastic. Getting students to write an exam or any number of exam questions, even if it's just getting them to write a multiple choice question at the end of every unit. For one thing, you can use some of the questions, and they love that on their exams. It's a great way to learn. And they provide answers and justify, they would have to justify the rationales. And you see the rest. There's certainly a number of them. Describe your dream job, evaluate a website. So those are just some of the ideas. Humanities type ideas: compare and contrast the state of knowledge on a topic in 2 different decades or eras. Conduct research, don't write a final draft. Prepare for a hypothetical interview with someone famous. Look at the difference between a scholarly journal and an article from a popular magazine. One of the best ways to get ideas about these things, to be honest, is to talk to your friends, talk to your colleagues, pop some ideas around. Everything you can do in your authentic assessment that makes it local makes it more difficult to purchase. And let's be honest, any student can get somebody to do an assignment for them if they really want to, whether that's their mother, their brother, their child, but in reality, that's always been the case. The contract cheating thing, if we stay away from traditional essays, we would argue that it's probably, we're moving a long way, not only to discouraging contract cheating, but more importantly, to make us excited about the program that they're in. And that's kind of it in a very quick nutshell. Are we able, Matthew, to go to questions now? How do we proceed? Viva exams, very much so. Yeah.
Sure. If anybody wants to ask questions via their microphone, they're welcome to put up their virtual hand using the little hand up Manny symbol-y thing down the bottom.
Uh,
Otherwise, keep typing into the text chat.
yes, you will absolutely get copies of the slides, Roderick, if you want them. Happy to share.
Yeah, the slides and the session recording will go onto the Transforming Assessment website sometime next week.
Annabelle put her hand up.
I have. Thank you very much, Carol. It's really been really interesting. I'm just coming from working with fully online small postgraduate courses where we have done a lot of authentic assessment and moving into an area where we've got massive first year and undergraduate courses with sort of thousands of students, very few teaching staff. So the problem obviously isn't the assessment, but the amount of staff available to market,
Absolutely.
which is a problem in itself. So I'm working at the moment trying to sort of address people's concerns about contract cheating and plagiarism and sharing of answers and quizzes and things like that, and sort of trying to do something, offer some pragmatic answers to how they can do some authentic assessment and maybe developmental assessment so that you get that process without putting an unrealistic strain on the markers. I'm wondering if you've got any. I mean, and obviously the problem is staffing and not the assessment design. But I'm wondering if you've got any suggestions for that kind of scenario.
If I've got a couple of things I actually used myself, but I'll just give you a very, very brief example. If you really think about the learning outcomes that you're trying to measure, we can often find ways to have the students go out and achieve those on their own, but not submit reams of material. One example I used, I was teaching a psychology course years ago, and rather than have the students write a big essay on it was a psychology of childhood course, so it was about disorders of childhood. Instead of having them write that, I got them to write a one-page advocacy letter for an issue. I got them to identify a real human being that could make a decision on that issue and do a very brief 3-paragraph argument based on 3 articles as to what they thought should be done persuasively. So honestly, it was as much work, and they didn't do a great job on it the first year I gave it because they thought it was a one-page business letter and they wouldn't have to do that much background work on it. Truthfully, it was a lot of work, and really they did the same amount of learning as they would have for a 2,500-word essay. But what my teaching assistants had to mark was a one-page business letter, and it worked really well.
Oh, good. And did you make that was that a fairly high stakes in comparison to the word limit? Because we often
it was 25% of their grade.
Okay, so even though it was a short word limit, it did sort of assess complex. That's a good thing to think about. Thank you.
And that's the real skill, is finding things to get them to submit. That's kind of like the Wikipedia idea where they've really got to be sure that they've got it right before they put it in. But then what gets marked are 2 paragraphs. And there's no shame in worrying about the amount of marking, because if we don't have the time to do it, that's not right either.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's a big,
right?
It's sort of thrown me quite a bit because it's obviously a really big concern. And my learning design skills are equipped to deal with much smaller and more high sort of staff rates. So that's very good to think about, and I'll take that back to my group. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Bobby's saying, isn't doing any calculations on paper inauthentic? Does anyone do calculations in real life? I think that's a very good question. And I think that depends on who's doing the calculations and what they're calculating and why. Because in some cases, I think we are starting to get students in different areas to do relatively inauthentic engagements with arithmetic and mathematics that they would not do in their chosen career. But it depends on what your job is and how you would do it. Because that's really about authenticity, is looking at the potential employment that the students will have afterward and seeing what kind of tasks they'll actually do.
I think some of that, I mean, the thing around the mathematics is, you're right, it's horses for courses, but if we think about the tools of the trade that are used in the profession, it then becomes about, mathematical literacy and statistical literacy. So we might be having them use sophisticated software to do the actual calculations, but then it's around interpreting the results or
Always.
collecting the data and, choosing the right tests to run, explaining why you've chose this test over the other one, that kind of stuff.
I think what we have to be careful of is that the core skills that we're getting them to learn are actually ones that will assist them with those tasks afterward. Whether that's estimation, tasks, we talk a fair amount about teaching very basic arithmetic, although we call it mathematics, to our nurses for drug calculations, to our pharmacists for drug calculations. And what level of mathematics do they require in order to apply these skills? And often it's estimation skills. It's knowing that when you get a wrong answer, it's really wrong. But then the question becomes, what are the actual skills that they will use in their careers for these things?
And that's why you need to be, obviously familiar with the target you're trying to teach.
That's right.
There's no point having people do, integral calculus when they're never going to use it. When they do, like I said, if it's an estimation job, right?
And if it becomes, well, we had a case, and we have changed this now, but we had a case where our pharmacists took a specific mathematics course because they do need to do calculations for drugs, and they were teaching them vectors, and they were failing because a pharmacist will never use vectors. And that's why, a lot of what we base, I think, assessment on is we've always done this, or this is a hoop and a really smart person can learn this. And that has nothing to do with constructive alignment or the achievement of learning outcomes. I think Jennifer's comment is interesting here, but when we're looking at what students might do in future jobs, how do you make it authentic for all or the majority of students in their future jobs? I think that's where we really start looking at interesting tasks that could be indicative to employers of a student having the skills that they want to see. And Zora's just talking about the practicalities for maths for nurses, and this is exactly, it's going to be stressful. Some students will always react to numbers with stress. But using those practical exams, I think, is absolutely the way to do it. We've got a hand up, Matthew. I just saw it come up.
Whoever has their hand up, you're welcome to just press the microphone button.
Just put their hand up.
Might have been a mistake. I'm not seeing any.
Maybe down?
Yeah. Yeah, possibly. Yeah.
I think one of the important points to this is when we say authentic, that's not necessarily overly specific, so that it may not be the exact task a student would do in their chosen career, but it is a task that's reflective of those type of skills. I think that's kind of an important thing to remember. I would like to comment where Paul said Zora, but that's also authentic as nurses work in stressful situations. I think we have to be careful interpreting experiences from one to another, because while nurses work in stressful situations, if we're teaching them how to do that, it shouldn't be by surprise. It should be intentional, and it should be by learning outcome. And interpreting that a nurse who has always been stressed by mathematics becomes stressed when they have to do these calculations in university, could or couldn't respond in a medical stressful situation, I think that's a stretch. And I certainly have seen people do things to students to trick them and fool them and then say, well, that's all right, they need to get used to stress. But I think we have to be careful transferring those things. Wow, that triple dose of morphine, that would be a bad calculation, yeah. There's a question there about rubrics or guidelines for marking the alternative ideas. Absolutely. Often they're not the traditional big wordy rubrics as much as scoring guidelines that would indicate what was expected to be included and then have very specific marks for the inclusion, often with embedded grading. Well, no, Peter, you wouldn't be stressed after your triple morphine dose. That would be fantastic, I would think, if you lived, which you did. The question about the rubrics and guidelines, I think, is important because one thing that happens when, if other than first year, first semester students, when you give authentic assessments to students in the rest of their program, they will often be very suspicious. And they'll say, does it have to be double spaced? And you say no. And they'll say, but doesn't it have to be this? And you'll go, nope, it's a business letter. We make them mistrust us. So when you're doing that grading or scoring guideline, often it's really helpful to have a very detailed guideline for how it's going to be scored, and also giving them models is very, very helpful to them. So show them what it will look like, obviously not the exact same one they're going to do, but giving them a model of, for example, we'll go back to our Wikipedia example, of what a great Wikipedia entry in a different discipline looked like will be helpful to our students, especially when we're asking them to do things they haven't necessarily been used to being asked to do before. And I fully agree with your exam setup should not be stressful. Exams are not meant to teach students how to handle stress. They're meant to measure the achievement of the learning outcomes that we set out for them in the first place. Yes, Matthew, absolutely get the students to discuss the examples. Having them mark one is one of the best ways to teach them how to do any kind of assignment. I don't know. Yeah, cooperative exams are an interesting concept. I'm not sure I would call them exams. I think we've got a lot of terminology going on here. Cooperative tasks that students are given, I'm assuming, Zara, what you're talking about is a cooperative task that students are given a finite amount of time to complete. Often, I think that's probably very reflective of the real world. I would be very careful with group grading in situations like that, however, for a whole number of reasons. That's interesting. If it's online exams, that really eliminates all your concern about students doing them together if you're encouraging them to do them together. And the big question is, are they learning? And if it's helping them learn the content, that's fantastic.
Zara, if you want to speak, just press the microphone button down the bottom center of the screen and away you go.
Hello. I was just referring to this cooperative exam as I learned a few years ago that you know how the final exams or the midterm exams are quite stressful for the students. So we were introduced with this idea that the exam is divided into two parts. It's a bit time consuming, but what the benefits were, like, you give one exam, say 30 or 40 multiple choice questions to students individually. You collect the exams after the certain period of time, and then you make groups and you give the same exam in a group setting. So you make smaller groups, like 3 or 4 students, and you give the same exam to the group. The group then completes the same exam and then the total mark is given as a percentage. So you give like 70% score of their individual task, and then 30% scores of their group work that they have done, and collectively they will get like 100% out of that. So some of the benefits were like the students we teach in a second language course, so the students are mostly Arabic speakers. So when they do the exam as a group, they can talk to each other in their own language, explain to them what it means, and then they answer the question. So it was more about like encouraging learning. Sometimes they didn't understand the multiple choice individually, so as a group they were able to understand more. And they got some benefits, like they got like a 30% score, which was part of the group work. So this is what we have done a few times in some of the courses, and the students really like it.
I bet they're really learning the content well too.
Okay, it looks like we're at the end of the hour soon. So thanks very much, Carol. That was a very interesting session, and we got a good bunch of discussion happening.
Absolutely.
So I will be certainly putting the recordings on the Transforming Assessment website along with your slide sets. So folks, thank you very much for coming. If you could please kindly fill in our feedback survey, that helps me justify my existence and spending time on this. So yeah, great. Thank you very much. I'm going to close off the recording, and we'll see you all again next month for the next Transforming Assessment session. Good work out to turn it off.
Thanks, everybody.
No worries. Bye-bye all.